Excellencies, distinguished guests and speakers, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and welcome to the second day of the 2020 ASEAN Leadership and Partnership Forum and Virtual Conference with the theme Partnership for a Cohesive and Responsive ASEAN. Today's conference will be conducted completely over Zoom, and we thank our speakers for their willingness to participate in this virtual conference. We'll now be starting off our virtual conference with a welcome speech from the founder and chairman of the Asian Leadership and Partnership Forum, Sri Michael Yeoh, who is also the president of the KSI Strategic Institute for Asia Pacific. Over to you, Sri.
Good morning. Very good to see all of you, excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. We are indeed very fortunate to have all of you to speak to us virtually at the 2020 ASEAN Leadership and Partnership Forum. This forum started yesterday with the session on the digital ASEAN that focuses on the transformation of ASEAN into a digital economy. We had a number of very distinguished speakers who were able to share with us the roadmap forward for ASEAN to succeed with this digital transformation. And I think many initiatives were put forward and suggested, and these will be part of our report that we will be submitting to the ASEAN Secretariat. We were also fortunate to have speaking with us on the virtual platform, the Second Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade of Brunei, His Excellency Dato Sri Setia Haji Irawan, as well as Myanmar's Minister of Commerce, Dr. Thiam. Both of them also shared their vision, their perspectives for ASEAN going forward. We are in a unique new normal, and most of the ASEAN meetings, including the first ASEAN summit this year, have been held virtually. And the ASEAN Economic Ministers meeting that was supposed to be taking place in Hanoi this week have also been held virtually, and the ASEAN Ministerial meeting coming up shortly will also be held virtually. So we are now in a new normal that will need us to connect virtually, but at the same time, I think all of us in ASEAN remain very committed to the spirit of ASEAN and to how ASEAN can move forward. We have heard from the ministers yesterday their aspirations for ASEAN in the next decade, and we also have heard many of the speakers speaking and highlighting on how digital transformation will move ASEAN forward into the next 10 to 20 years towards the ASEAN 2025 vision. We are very delighted today to have with us many other speakers, including from the key partners of ASEAN. From the USA, we have Ambassador Michael Michalak, an old friend of ASEAN, Senior Vice President of the US-ASEAN Business Council. Welcome here, Ambassador Michalak. We are also very pleased to bring back another old friend from Japan, Ambassador Masataka Fujita, Secretary General of the ASEAN-Japan Center, which has been in the forefront of promoting ASEAN-Japan relations. From Australia, I'm very pleased to welcome my very old friend, Penny Burtt, the Group CEO of Asialink University, whom we have met many, many years ago when you were here in the Australian High Commission in Kuala Lumpur, and continuing in many other roles. We are also very delighted to have from Bangkok another old friend, Dr. Mikic, Director of Trade and Investment in the UN ESCAP headquarters in Bangkok. And we have from Brunei, from Manila, other speakers who are with us here today. So we hope that we would have a very interesting first session that will focus on ASEAN's economic challenges. And this session, another old friend, Dr. Chheang Vannarith, President of the Asian Vision Institute in Cambodia, will be moderating this session. After this, we will have the second session that would bring together many civil society leaders and people who have been very active in the social enterprise space, that will be chaired by Dr. Dennison, and that will enable us to connect on how the younger people in ASEAN can promote entrepreneurship, startups, and social enterprises. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's second day of the 2020 ASEAN Leadership and Partnership Forum. I would hand the floor over to the moderator for the first session, Dr. Chheang Vannarith, to start your session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sri Michael Yeoh, for the opportunities. So I'm going to be the moderator of this first session of today, virtual conference. We have with us the great honor to have with us today distinguished speakers from our regions, including Dr. Mikic, from the Director of Trade, Investment and Innovation Division at the United Nations ESCAP, Ms. Penny Burtt, Group Chief Executive Officer, Asialink, University of Melbourne, Dr. To Minh Tu, Deputy Director, Institute of Foreign Affairs and Strategic Study, Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, Ambassador Masataka Fujita, Secretary General of ASEAN-Japan Center, Ambassador Michalak, Senior Vice President and Regional Managing Director, ASEAN US Business Council, Mr. Leigh, Acting Commissioner to Southeast Asia, Victorian Government Trade and Investment Southeast Asia, Dr. Thiam, Principal Economist, Southeast Asia Department from the Asian Development Bank, Mr. Vijay Poonoosamy, Director International and Public Affairs, Shuai Group, and Mr. Shazali Sulaiman, Partner Shazali and Partners. So welcome to our panel discussions. Before we proceed to our discussion, allow me to give you some basic facts about ASEAN. In terms of GDP, the combined GDP of ASEAN is about 3.2 trillion US dollar. It ranks as the 5th largest economy in the world, with a total of population of more than 650 million. So in terms of the population size, it's one of the largest after, the third largest after China and India. The youth population also very remarkable in this region. We have about 215 million youth population aged between 15 to 34 years old. So that is also a great potential, demographic potential for this region as it moves forward. In terms of digitalization and internet penetration, we also see the increasing number of ASEAN population get access to the internet with the penetration rate of about 70%, social media penetration more than 60%, and mobile connectivity 132%. So that also another indicators about the digital dynamics, digital connectivity and dynamics in these regions. On the ASEAN Economic Community, now the ASEAN Secretariat is conducting a midterm review of its AEC Blueprint 2025. The ASEAN Single Window is now operating live in all 10 ASEAN member states, and other trade and investment facilitation is ongoing. So the problem or the gaps that ASEAN is facing at this stage is the intra-ASEAN trade in goods remain quite low, only 23%. The intra-ASEAN trade in services 15.7%, and the intra-ASEAN investment only 15.8%. So this is some of the challenges that ASEAN is facing. So now within the context of COVID-19 that we're going to hear from our panelists, how the COVID-19 affects the ASEAN economies and the future of economic recovery of these regions. So first, let me ask the panelists, first question here is the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the geopolitical competition, especially between the US and China on the ASEAN economy. So let's start with Dr. Mikic from UN-ESCAP. Dr. Mia, can you hear us? Yes, please.
I'm just having a little bit trouble unmuting myself, sorry. Well, thank you very much for this wonderful introduction and the spread of the facts and the other important information about ASEAN as well as the context of the situation. Let me go straight into what you are trying to get out of here. And I think it's very difficult to talk about ASEAN as a homogeneous economic space because it is not. And so the impacts of both, COVID and the extended and deepened trade tensions are variable across the economies, depending on the fundamentals of these economies and depending, of course, on their ability to act to the immediate changes in the external environment. But overall, if we are looking at the estimates of the IMF with respect to forecasts of the growth for this year, as the bloc, they're expected to actually have a decline in the output of about 2%, with still forecasted recovery at around 6% for next year. But I'm sure that my colleague from ADB can provide further details for this estimate. I think what is really worrying is the loss of employment and the work hours. So if you look at the ILO statistics, close to 15% of work hours have been already lost in second quarter of this year. And this is worrying because then when you look at the share of the labor force that is actually able to work from home, it's very low for us, and it's about 7%. So even though the region is one of the best digitally connected, the ability to use that in a productive way is definitely something that is worrying. And so I think in terms of challenges in the context of the trade tension as well, there are two sort of separate tensions. The old one that came from the bilateral US-China, let me call it trade war, although not everyone would agree with that, which requested already some of the repositioning of the ASEAN countries that are very well embedded in so-called factory Asia and were impacted positively and negatively from that trade tension. But now with COVID, we are actually looking in a very different regional and global trade environment with, of course, lesser and lesser support from the multilateral system. We can talk about the details later on. And I think ASEAN as a bloc is well positioned to safeguard some sort of law and order in terms of trade. And I think yesterday at the 8th meeting for RCEP, the ministers were very clear that they will be proceeding with that in order to actually preserve that large market for the ASEAN economies. So let me stop there, given the limited time we have for these remarks, and I will be happy to expand on any of these issues and others later. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Thiam from the Asian Development Bank.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Yes, I think, we very much share the similar views with our colleagues from ESCAP. As we all know, we just had the second quarter numbers for most of the countries being released. So we see that many of the countries suffered huge declines in the GDP. So I think overall, as a region, we now expect ASEAN to have a first ever decline since the global Asian financial crisis in 1997. So and the reason is simple. ASEAN, as we all know, is a relatively open economy, and this COVID-19 pandemic is a global phenomenon, right? No region is left unscathed. At the same time, in order to control the impact of the COVID, we also had to impose restrictive measures, right? Many other countries have been in some version of lockdown since March. The good news is we do see sort of the COVID being under control in some of the countries. And the big, I think, bright spot that we can see is, of course, the lockdown measures. So we do see some more activities happening in the region. But more importantly, we do see sort of China sort of recovering quite quickly. So although travel is, the Chinese tourists are not going to come back anytime soon, we do see exports to China able to pick up. And more importantly, the supply chain that was disrupted when China closed down a lot of its factory can now continue. So we do see a manufacturing sector picking up going ahead. I'll just stop now for now. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Leigh from the Victorian Government Trade and Investment.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to be here virtually with you all. So, I was looking at this question and I thought it would be good to perhaps by way of answering the question to talk a little bit about what we do as a state government, because we're quite unique in terms of a state government having the level of international engagement that we do, and that extends to Southeast Asia. So we operate a network of international offices, and we have 22 offices globally. 3 of those offices are in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, KL and Jakarta. And I'm very pleased to say that our next global office will be in Vietnam, opening later this year. So I think that demonstrates the importance of Southeast Asia and how we interact with Southeast Asia, because it's the region is our second largest trading partner overall. So for me, when I saw this question, I knew there'd be some big macro numbers to look at, but I also thought it'd be good to highlight where we've seen the sectors of impact. So it's been said before that COVID-19 is a global phenomenon and it's affected a lot of parts of the world in a similar way. And I think it's affected all of the ways that we work. Case in point, credit to the organisers. I was able to attend the first part of this conference in person yesterday in KL, and now here we are appearing virtually. But for us, as an exporting state, supply chains and the supply chain impact, the supply chain disruption in Southeast Asia has been a noticeable change, and particularly as passenger aircraft travel has reduced, that's had a flow-on impact to freight. And so we're seeing that impact both intra-ASEAN, but also then as in terms of international trade. So for us, we would typically see Southeast Asian nations looking to import a lot of premium produce coming in via air freight, and that's certainly died off. Well, not died off, but been made difficult by the supply chain disruption. At the same time, to contrast, with challenges, we're also seeing opportunities. So for us, there's been a noticeable uptick in terms of e-commerce and e-commerce exports. So we've seen the reports that e-commerce was already booming prior to COVID, but the pandemic has really seemed to accelerate the adoption of e-commerce and the way that ASEAN consumers are able to access the goods and products that they're after. So, widespread impact in terms of COVID-19. At the same time, in some ways, challenges accelerate the inevitable. They bring about change that was already on the way, and we're starting to see some of that manifest itself. So I hope that's useful just to highlight a couple of sectors in my response, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Next, Ms. Penny Burtt from the Asialink, University of Melbourne.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be joining you this morning. In talking about the impact of COVID-19, both on the regional economy and the broader geopolitical outlook, I wanted to make some points that haven't yet been picked up by the previous speakers in terms of impact. First of all, I think a very powerful point that was made earlier this year by Indonesia's Finance Minister, Sri Mulyani, was that in a very short period of time, COVID-19 and the pandemic has actually, for some ASEAN countries, wiped off roughly the last 10 years of development. And if you look through that lens of development, that has actually got profound implications for inequality, because ASEAN has made such enormous gains in addressing poverty and inequality over the last 10 years. The idea that in fact, the economic impact of COVID doesn't just mean a numbers-based contraction in economic activity, but could fundamentally impact for the longer term the growth trajectory for some of ASEAN's less developed members is actually quite an important point to call out. I also wanted to call out the point that's been very well made, in fact, by the chairman of the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, Tan Sri Munir Majid, in several public forums. And that is, again, underneath the big macro numbers, we've seen a disproportionate impact on SMEs all the way across ASEAN. And in fact, for many of the ASEAN economies, SMEs constitute around 80% of the total number of companies in those economies. And to quote Tan Sri, while SMEs are the backbone of the ASEAN economy, that backbone during COVID has been effectively snapped. The other thing I wanted to, third point on economic impact, related to inequality, is that women are actually suffering the disproportionate economic impact of COVID. That is because they tend to be concentrated in part-time and casual work, also disproportionately represented in sectors such as retail and hospitality, which have been impacted by declines in tourism, as well as the restrictions in individual economies. So women are experiencing a much higher level of job losses and employment insecurity that's likely to persist, for the immediate future. On the geostrategic impact of what we've seen with continuing US-China tensions, even during the period of COVID, it is worth calling out that you've seen a major shift in global supply chains for many multinationals away from China and into ASEAN. So at the same time as you've got deep economic challenges, you've also got an opportunity there with new FDI flows across the region. And that's been quite marked in the case, for example, of the Vietnamese economy. So I'm just going to stop there.
Thank you very much, Ms. Penny Burtt. I think so far we have covered quite a number of areas that have been affected by COVID-19 and US-China competition, including the disruption of supply chains, development inequality, women, also women issues, the inequality of gender, tourism to some extent have been, to a large extent have been affected, and of course the impacts on the unemployment, which is very, very critical issue. So next, I would like to invite Mr. Vijay Poonoosamy from QI Group, please.
Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Now, clearly, C-19 is a dramatic, ongoing global wake-up call and a game changer. A game changer in terms of public health, social engagements, how we see others and how others see us, and of course, in terms of economic activities. The IMF downgraded its global growth forecast from 3.3% in January to minus 4.9% in June. For the ASEAN region, ADP estimated that growth will drop from 4.4% to 1% this year, and that C-19's economic impact could reach $253 billion US dollars. For the Asia-Pacific region, ADP estimated that up to 170 million jobs could be lost, and the labor income could drop by 550 billion US dollars. This is clearly a time for new mindsets, to find new solutions for the new normal. And this new normal of diluted globalization and undiluted nationalism makes, to my mind, the path between going global and going alone even more appealing. And that path is regionalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Shazali Sulaiman from Shazali and Partners, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to give my views from the Brunei Darussalam perspective. I think Brunei is a bit more unique. We are totally dependent on the oil and gas sector. And the oil prices have been going the wrong way from our perspective. 90% of our exports are in the oil and gas sector. So a lot of SMEs and contractors that support the energy sector has suffered badly. Unemployment is probably a growing issue. And because of our high youth population, we are also seeing increased unemployment of more than 10% of our population. But what's happened with COVID is, it's actually been a wake-up call. You know, when students had to study from home, we realized that more than 20–30% of students do not have access to internet. They do not have access to an iPad for them to actually study at home. So then there was this digital divide between those who have and those who have not. And there's a lot of students who are slightly disadvantaged over the last 2–3 months where they have to study from home. So we needed to look at other ways of doing education, actually sending things to them in hard copies more than anything else. More than 90% of companies in Brunei are SMEs, and they have been badly affected due to COVID. But the only positive thing about COVID is Bruneians tend to like to go across the border every weekend. Sabah and Sarawak is quite close by to Brunei. It doesn't take long to drive across. And a lot of money has actually been spent in East Malaysia. And actually, East Malaysia has suffered from Bruneians not actually going across. But what's happened is, we have developed what is buy locally to support local industries. And a lot of retail outlets, a lot of supermarkets and restaurants have actually benefited from COVID because people are now staying in Brunei. We do not travel out, although we have not had a high incidence of cases, but we have still closed our borders from people coming in and from us going out. And actually, if I want to fly out, that's why I'm not in here. It's quite a long process just to get out of Brunei. Because every time you go out, when you come back, you still have to go through the 2 weeks quarantine, mandatory quarantine at hotels and different centers. So I think COVID has actually been a wake-up call. You know, we are going to chair ASEAN next year, and I think COVID will still be with us next year. And there's going to be challenges when we look at intra-ASEAN trade, services, businesses. And when you look at the statistics, less than 20% of trade happens within ASEAN. So with COVID, you know, we've slightly been insulated in terms of trade within ASEAN. I think maybe what we need to do is to see how we can increase that to 40–50%. Then it becomes a true economic bloc where there is free trade between the 10 ASEAN countries. So for now, you know, the statistics shows that there is insufficient trade, services, and investment within the ASEAN countries. So I think that needs to be done. And I think one of the biggest challenge we have is the disparity in terms of the per capita income of the rich ASEAN countries like Brunei and Singapore, and the other economies which have very low capacity per capita income. So I think to bridge the income gap, the poverty gap, I think that's going to be the big challenge, even with or without COVID. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. So I think you brought a new dimension of the development gap within Southeast Asia, especially between the new and the old ASEAN member states, and the COVID-19 perhaps accentuate or exacerbate this kind of regional development disparity. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Tho Minh Thu from the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased and happy to join this online virtual conference today. And so far, I'm enjoyed listening to the other panelists, and I agree with almost all of your point. And so regarding the challenges to ASEAN amidst the COVID-19, I would like to add some point that has been touched upon so far. I think the COVID-19 has revealed the challenge and the cohesion between the economic challenge and other non-traditional security challenges. So never so far we see that economic development is dependent on this something very non-economic aspect of life. And so I would like to bring it further. That is, economic and non-traditional security are very interlinked, and they are creating like a nexus for development. So that make us to think that when we look at the solutions to overcome economic challenge, we have to tap upon the solution that break the nexus. For example, the pandemic is not only bring about like the disruption, the supply chain disruption, but also like poverty, and also like Penny Butt has just mentioned, like the inequalities between men and women, and the digital device between the those who can access the internet with and those who cannot. So I think we have to look at the picture as a whole and find like the weakest link and where to tap upon. I think another point that hasn't been touched upon, and I also want to highlight, is the risk of the public debt risk. Probably not in this year, but in the coming years, as we can see all around the regions and all around the world, central banks are pouring money into the market, and they are printing money, they are borrowing, and I think everywhere public debt is rising, and it is really something that we have to look very carefully. And I would like to I think although we are we are having such kind of difficult situation now, but I think the good thing is that ASEAN is still trying to unite, still trying our best to be a cohesive and responsive regions grouping. So we are glad that this year, although the thing happened very suddenly, but if you look at the ASEAN agendas, we haven't missed anything. So all of the priorities put forward has been implemented. So everything is still going on planned, although virtually. And I think even more than that, we have been doing better, and ASEAN is one of the, I think, the regional grouping that has been quite responsive to the new challenge. So we are one of the very first groupings who held the summit, the ASEAN Plus Summit on COVID-19 early in I think in March or in April. So still we are very linked together and we are working very close together. So yeah, back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. We will discuss further on the ASEAN response after this round of questions. We reserved the last spot for our two veteran diplomats, two ambassadors, who are also a long time observers of ASEAN and regional affairs. So after listening to all these comments, view and perspective, I would like to ask the Ambassador Masataka Fujita from the ASEAN-Japan Center, how you see the impacts of this COVID-19 on the ASEAN region? Please, Ambassador.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting ASEAN-Japan Centers. I'm very pleased to be one of the panelists for this very relevant and very important meetings. Now, so of course, you picked up the very most relevant topic today. Now, so let me tell you what I'm thinking about this particular impact of the COVID. Was first of all, I appreciate ASEAN very much, as in fact ASEAN made a political commitment earlier than anybody else, earlier than G7 or earlier than the G20 political commitment. I think political commitment is quite important, so that the ministries can issue various measures to mitigate or adapt to the impact of the COVID. Now, of course, the COVID itself affects everybody equally in a sense, so, which is a bit different from the past crisis you experience, like Asian finance crisis in 1998 or Lehman shocks in 2007, 2008, which started the impact on the financial economy, then the gradually is moving to the other side. But this particular crisis or the impact is much beyond in the financial sector. Obviously, it affects both demand and supply sector at the same time. So therefore, we have a serious effect from this particular crisis than any other crisis we have had. Now, then even if everybody is more or less affected, but the question is how to recover. Depending on how we recover, fallout is different. Now, so, as you know, so since the COVID started, political communities more or less all the time they say resilient economy or resilient supply chain. Resilience has become kind of catchword, so for the post or even with the COVID era. Now, then how can we make the resilience or our economy more resilient? In fact, of course, ASEAN already has certain kind of resilience, but because of COVID, it fell down dramatically. Now, so we are in the bottom stage, and all the countries have to provide the measures to deal with this. Therefore, the first reactions from the government is how to save the companies, how to save or how to keep the lives of the people and so on, which is right. But after this, they need something because we are moving to the recovery stage. Depending on what kind of the recovery or recovery policies, it all depends. You may go back to the old levels of the resiliency, but this is not what we are aiming at. We are aiming at the higher resilient level, higher than before. So this process is quite important. And some speakers mentioned that the current pandemic is a game changer. I agree. In fact, this is even driver and the catalyst to change. Then the question is, of course, how we can make ourselves or make our economy or supply chains more resilient. So I have several suggestions for you. First, obviously, is what kind of policies, measures, actions, so related supply chains or related economy you put in practice. When I looked at the policies or the individual ASEAN member states introduced, particularly those which affect supply chains, there are some, but not many yet, because most of the countries still are busy with how to save their companies. But later on, you have to bring more policies to foster or strengthen supply chains. In fact, on this particular point, the Japanese government introduced their initiatives to multiplicate or increase the number of the supply chains in ASEAN. So this kind of practical policy measures, perhaps you may think to introduce. At this moment, what they're doing is at the most, for example, you open up different cities for the trade so that they can continue to have so smooth flows of goods and services. Or so you may introduce so e-measures to facilitate border measure. I mean like e-issuance of the certificate of origins and so on, which is good. But obviously, so if you want to have a longer lasting so impact, then perhaps you may have to think more. The second area I want to tell you is particularly improvement in risk management. So this is not the first time to have a crisis. So in the past, even we experienced natural disasters. Japan's all the times, hit by big earthquakes. 2011, as you know, have a big earthquake in the Tohoku areas. In the same year, Thai had a big flood. So each time we have a risk, different risks. So therefore, the companies have to take into account of various risks into management. That's quite important. Well, some things which was the topic of the yesterday's discussion on digital transformation. Both Japan and the ASEAN learned or even recognized how slow we are in the digital transformation. And this is area, particularly Japan, also ASEAN, can collaborate. So we have to kind of have, so digital supply chain, digital chains, or supply chains rather with the IT or ICT technologies. That's what you should aim at. Particularly telemedicine is a good example between particular ASEAN and Japan, to promote. And the fourth area is promoting new industries which are resilient, which are resistant to the crisis. There are many, actually. For example, by looking at the futures of ASEAN, in fact, the moderator said ASEAN is youth. ASEAN has a lot of the youth, so youth populations are still quite big. I agree. But ASEAN is also moving toward the aging society, like Japan did. Only within 25 years, Japan became aging society. And with the same number of years, with 25 years, ASEAN also becomes aging society. You may reach by 2050. And then there's another problem here. The reason is that if you look at how your economies is growing, look at ASEAN miracle or Asia miracle. People say that Asia grows simply because of the lot of putting more people or putting more machinery and so on, or capital or labor inputs. Because of this, ASEAN is growing. I'm not necessarily in 100% agreement with this, because someone says, of course, the capital's productivity is also increasing and so on. But there's a danger here. If there is a stop of the labor increase, then obviously, so you may reach, or you may continue to be trapped in the middle income or middle income trap. Before you reach the higher income stage, countries' growth dying out. This is not, of course, we don't want to see. So therefore, actually, it's promoting industries that are resilient to the crisis, quite important. Now, the final area, sorry, I'm getting a bit long, but let me tell you the final area. So we have to reconsider our company strategies for international production. Why is the supply chain disrupted? Simply because transnational cooperation companies established what they call integrated international production system. That guarantees you the highest efficient production. But because of this crisis cut off the supply chains, and everybody's and all the companies face problems in even procuring the materials which is required for the lives, particularly like some personal protective equipment, PPEs, the products, or the or anything which related to deal with COVID crisis. Now, we have to face the situations where actually the world is slowing down globalization already. Globalization is not progressing since 2015. Okay, UNCTAD said globalization stopped or slowed down after 2015. You may say, no, 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 ASEAN is different. ASEAN is growing. ASEAN is increasing trade or investment flow. It is true when you look at the trade volumes or FDI. But if you look at this in terms of GDP, for example, it's not growing. In fact, so even declining as a percentage of GDP, I mean like FDI as a percent GDP, for example, it's not declining, or it's not increasing. It's almost even the same or even declined after 2015. So therefore, actually, so globalizations, so is always slowing down. Now this is where we see the rivalry between or decoupling of the United States to China. Some people say it may be good for ASEAN because they may move out what they have in China or to ASEAN. So some countries benefit from this rivalry. But it is something that we, ASEAN, is happy with? It's not. Simply because already is globalization getting smaller, and now this was decoupling, getting further their pie of global economy smaller. Therefore, in the long run, this decoupling affects badly ASEAN as a whole. So these 5 areas I mentioned to you are quite important for ASEAN to make your economies more resilient than before, or your supply chains more resilient than before. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You have raised the 5-point solution that we will further elaborate some of those points at our last round of the question of our panel discussion today. Next, I would like to invite Ambassador Michael Michalak from the US-ASEAN Business Council.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to, I'll try to be brief, but I think that I wanted to look at this kind of in the, from the standpoint of where we are now. I think that's the session is sort of where are we now, what has been the effect of COVID on the ASEAN economies, and we've heard an awful lot about that today. I think that one of the biggest things that the COVID virus has done is it has accentuated some of the weaknesses that exist in the global economic and trading system. I think that when we look at the US and China, this is the biggest factor that was looming on the horizon prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it has exacerbated some of the differences between those two countries. It has, this of course is probably the lowest point in our relationship between the US and China. And I can tell you for certain that when the COVID pandemic is once and for all, or as once and for all as we can hope, dealt with, we cannot go back to business as usual, business as it was before the pandemic, before the tensions came out between the US and China. So that's going to be a fact of life, and we'll just have to deal with it. The other thing that I think the virus has done, even though I agree with our colleague from Thailand that and some of our with Ambassador Fujita, who's talked about the way in which ASEAN came out very early and had great high-level responses, great political statements, and I think that that's true, and I think that has been of great benefit. But those statements are fine at the hortatory level, at the aspirational level. What has happened is that further down the decision chain, decisions have been made much slower. The mechanisms that are essential in order to keep the flow of goods and services robust and flowing through our economies has gotten much slower and is just fraught with a number of bureaucratic and systemic regulatory related issues, which have caused much more friction in global supply chains, and that has added to some of the frictions that have resulted from some of the trade tensions that exist around the region. The other thing I think that the pandemic has done is accentuate inequalities which have existed for many, many years around the globe. I think that Penny had a great summation of inequalities among minorities, among the poor, disadvantaged, many different ways in which we look at some of the inequalities which exist around the world. And I guess that finally, what the biggest things that we have seen is the impetus towards digital economy. The fact that we are now practicing social distancing and practicing isolations and lockdowns has meant that we are forced to use the digital economy. And what we are seeing now is we are seeing not so much the integration of the digital economy, which would allow us to make optimum use of cloud and of many other types of digital connectivity and software and other solutions there. But what we're seeing now as a result of the virus is that the splinter net is more common than the internet, that each country, each region is developing its own rules and regulations which are not compatible with rules and regulations on the other side. This kind of economic nationalism, this economic protectionism has been probably the single most worrisome phenomenon that has come out of the pandemic. What we are learning is that the digital economy in the past was an enhancement to your business program, to your business strategy. And the pandemic has shown us that the digital economy is an essential competitive part of your strategy and has to be dealt with that way. I was not present at the discussion yesterday, but I think I hope that came up with a number of different solutions that we can use going forward. So I think the US-China relationship is going to be changed quite a bit, and how that is going to change and what its ultimate effects on the global trading system will be are yet to be worked out. I think that there are opportunities for progress as well as opportunities for further deterioration. The inequalities which have been uncovered by the COVID virus have brought to light inequalities which have existed again quite a long time. And it's time now that all of these inequalities are dealt with in a more open and serious manner. The existing supply chains are being disrupted and will have to resort themselves out. In this regard, ASEAN does have a role to play. I think, and we should also be congratulating ASEAN on dealing with the RCEP and getting that done during the Vietnam chair year. I think it's great. But all of those things are things which define where we are now. And I think Ambassador Fujita kind of gave us some hints as to where we can go in the future to try and resolve this. And I think that's where we're going to be going with the next number of questions. But it's a very serious situation. There's usually a silver lining to these things, and we can talk about some positives out of the current pandemic, but most of it is not positive. And we have to be dealing with this in a very serious and forceful manner. And I look forward to continuing the discussion and coming up with some of my own solutions as to what ASEAN might do going forward. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Back to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think that you have set a kind of a new platform for us to discuss with regards to the role of ASEAN and the future directions that it might lead to. Next, I would like to ask Dr. Mikic from ESCAP about your assessment of the role of ASEAN. There are some critiques that ASEAN is united in words but fragmented in actions. So the national government of ASEAN pursue its own national strategy with regards to their response to the COVID-19. Dr. Mikic, your perspective, please.
Well, thank you very much. And at this stage, maybe I should say two things. One, what I'm saying really is my personal view, but I will try to bring also the elements of our Secretary General policy brief that he issued just a month ago, actually, almost on a day, in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on Southeast Asia, and that was presented to the officials at the meeting in Vietnam. But I think we have heard lots of speakers referring to the actions or not of ASEAN, and in my perspective, and in sharp contrast to what was happening after the crisis in 2008, the sort of global and regional cooperation was really weak in response to COVID. And yes, ASEAN reacted in early April with a statement with respect to COVID, and have set up the response fund to COVID that I think has managed so far to gather about $1 million, which is greatly insufficient with respect to the needs. Even though the areas that were aligned for that fund to look into as with respect to regional cooperation, procurement, etc., are actually those that should have been looked from the very beginning, from January, when we were understanding that this is going to be human-to-human transmission of virus, and that that no country can solve it on its own because it will be cross-border problems, right? So I think the reactions, of course, the G20 came much later, and still are not putting themselves in any leadership role there. But in the context of ASEAN, I think much more can be done to invoke all the regional mechanisms that are put in place nominally, but are not actually used in this context. For example, a single window, ASEAN single window was mentioned. Yet, when we were looking at the supply of goods across the borders, it didn't really work, right? So I think it was very much mentioned that there are still so many bottlenecks in those in terms of operational things, and that we should be really focusing more on implementing all of these very good mechanisms that are put in place through the ASEAN integration that is moving forward. Now, in terms of Secretary General's brief and recommendations to ASEAN for taking actions, or perhaps diagnosing where the actions were lacking, or where the inherent problems and weaknesses that were also mentioned are preventing ASEAN to move faster, there are 4 areas. It's definitely inequality, bridging the digital divide, ensuring a green recovery, and also upholding human rights and good governance policies. Let me remind you that we live in the era of sustainable development goals, and so us as a regional commission, we are actually monitoring the progress of countries towards these goals and the targets that are set. And in our report at the end of 2019, it was very clear that ASEAN as a bloc, and then to a degree most of the countries, were failing on reaching equality or improving inequality, and were failing in some other of these goals. So with that, and with the shock of COVID, I fully agree with what Penny was saying and others in terms of inequalities. And I would like to bring to attention really the need to perhaps really focus on expanding the universal healthcare system, because it was clearly shown that depending on the quality of a health system, the country's response and the success in the response to the COVID was there as well, and that of course needs to take into account those that are really very often forgotten, like migrants and the people that have actually no national status in the country, yet they would need to have some cover in those. And it has to take into account the movement of people across the region, which is certainly lacking for now. And there are, of course, many more things that should be dealt with in terms of improving the status on inequality, but maybe we can turn to that a little bit later. In terms of the digital divide, I think what is most important, of course, investment in infrastructure, and this is the key. This is like, you know, do you have electricity or not, in sense of do you have access to the high quality and affordable internet. However, what we really need to do in ASEAN with respect to putting it to the productive use is look at the legal and regulatory barriers for expansion of the digital economy across the region, and to have it as a single really economic zone. And this is what is still not being done, and where much more needs to be done in order to fully use the advantages of digital technologies and other frontier technologies that the region can use for the advancement. So let me stop here, because I know that my co-panelists have a very important and valuable inputs also to share, and I would like to listen to them as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mikic. May I invite Ms. Penny Burtt, because she's going to leave us in 10 minutes, to shed the light on the women or gender inequality and women empowerment issue within the context of ASEAN, and what ASEAN need to do more when it comes to gender inequality. Ms. Penny Burtt, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vannarith. Let me speak very briefly about what more we can do on the inequality front and women. I think there are three things that are very important as we move forward. Number one is actually recognizing the unique problems that have faced women during this period of the pandemic, and being clear around the data and the impact. Number two, we actually need to use those insights to include in policymaking going forward on the recovery, what we call a gendered lens. So rather than thinking it's a one-size-fits-all set of responses, actually have in mind the differential impact specifically on women. The third thing, and I think this picks up a little bit of what Dr. Mia was saying, and also Ambassador Mike earlier, core to this economic recovery is going to be digital enablement writ large, and skilling our entire communities to be engaging differently to take advantage of that opportunity. And we know that both in terms of infrastructure, learning opportunities, and broader access, women are not as well positioned as men to take advantage of that, of the digital economy moving forward. In fact, we've recently published a special report on women in STEM in Australia and Southeast Asia, and the number of women, not just in the broader community who don't have digital access, but when we're talking about Industrial Revolution 4.0, the fact that we are going to be in an entirely new technology environment, women are dramatically underrepresented, both at school level and at university level, with the exciting exception of Brunei, might I say, in the STEM disciplines, engineering, and in the digital economy piece in education more broadly. So those are three specific recommendations I would have for how in transitioning through COVID can actually better tap that half of the community. And that is tracking the data, taking a kind of gendered lens as we're developing responses. And then when we're picking up on the opportunity of the digital economy and the new economy, recognizing that that means addressing the whole issue of women in STEM more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Burtt, for giving us 3 points, very clear, for gender responsive recovery to make it more inclusive in terms of economic recovery. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Thiam from the Asian Development Bank on unemployment issue that you raised earlier. That is very serious issue. And from your point of view, has ASEAN done anything with regards to dealing with this unemployment issue and how to raise the job opportunity, to increase the job opportunities across the regions? Dr. Thiam?
Yeah, thank you very much. And of course, unemployment is very much a national issue. ASEAN can support, creating employment, but basically through creating, how should we say, a conducive environment to facilitate free trade of free flow of goods and trade and services throughout the region, right? As we saw, because of the COVID, we now have many restrictions in the region. So goods, I think, pretty much has been, to a certain extent normalized, but business travel is still very much restricted, right? So unless we can get this economy going back on, then this sort of business travel, which are usually necessary, we could face a difficulty to see economy recovering. So I think that would be one way is basically, of course, there's a lot of talk about travel bubble. Here in Malaysia, there's already discussion between Malaysian government and Singapore government. Actually, they already done it, still very limited, sort of a green lane for essential business travel between Malaysia and Singapore. So I think one way that ASEAN can sort of support this is basically, a lot of this kind of arrangements are on a bilateral basis, right? So is there some way we can come up with a regional template on how do we facilitate this kind of travel? I think this would be a big boost to helping the region. And at the same time, we all know that, of course, tourism is a big contributor to both jobs and growth in the region. And tourism basically, international tourism, cross-border tourism is basically at a standstill now. So we need to sort of try to also find ways to sort of facilitate the resumption of this, because a lot of jobs are at stake here, and unless the tourism can come back, and this is a little bit more tricky because, of course, although we have a lot of intra-ASEAN tourism, we also have a lot of tourist flows from outside the region. So it's maybe harder, but I think if within ASEAN we can come up with a plan on how to ensure safe travels, then we can also help convince other countries to sort of allow their people to travel to ASEAN and vice versa. So I think those are the key things. And of course, I think we should not, the other thing about dealing with these job losses, of course, although we see things recovering, the recovery may be slow, and many of the jobs may not be, may not be coming back. So social protection is very important. And also, how should we say, support for workers to transform or to move into new areas will be very much needed. So within that, I think we can see where ASEAN could play a role. Of course, is how do we encourage, how do we facilitate more labor flows across the region, right? So there may be a shortage of a certain type of workers in one country, and there's a surplus in another country, and this is where obviously there will be can be tremendous benefit if one workers could relocate to another. I'll just stop here now.
Thank you, thank you. I would like to seek the view from private sector in this region. First, Mr. Shazali Sulaiman, what is the role of the private sector in this process of regional recovery? How to make it more inclusive, green, gender inclusive, and so on. So, Mr. Shazali?
I'll give you the man in the street view in Brunei, perhaps in terms of my comments. About 70% of Bruneians work for the Brunei government. So because we have a high number of population working for the Brunei government, it actually acts as a stabilizing factor in terms of our consumer and retail market. So respective where the economy is, 20% will still get their full salary. 93% of companies in Brunei, SMEs, sorry, 93% of companies are MSMEs. And out of that, 65% are micro industries, which means they only have 5 or less employees. So a lot of the business sector in Brunei are totally, I guess, blinded as to what's happening within ASEAN because they're more interested in their own domestic economy. So a lot of people in Brunei in terms of business are not concerned about ASEAN, the AEC, all the initiative in terms of free trade, except for maybe a few medium-sized industries. So what can private sector do in terms of the economy? I think the most important thing for us to address unemployment is to diversify our economy away from the oil and gas sector. And in order to diversify, I think government needs to get more FDIs into Brunei. So in order to get more FDIs into Brunei, we need to make investment climate a bit more conducive for investment. And also we need to prime the economy in terms of short-term economic recovery to look at certain sectors which we could diversify in terms of the manufacturing-based, Islamic banking, Islamic financing, and other industries which are away from oil and gas. We work very closely with Singapore. So in terms of whatever monetary policy that we have, someone talked about printing money, quantitative easing. I mean, that is some of the roles of the central bank. Because Brunei's currency is comparative with Singapore dollar, it's interchangeable, we can use Brunei dollars in Singapore and vice versa. Any monetary policy that is done by the Brunei government will have to be in line with also the Monetary Authority of Singapore. So there has to be some sort of G2G discussion about other quantitative easing and other policies in terms of trying to help support the private sector. I believe with COVID, what's happened is countries have become a bit more internally focused to try to see what they can do to help the SMEs and micro industries, rather than look at ASEAN and export-based industry. So I think a lot of the government focus has been to see how they can help the micro industries, which are predominant industry in Brunei. And the micro industries here are predominantly women in Brunei that actually run a lot of these micro industries. And the good thing about women entrepreneurs is they are very good at paying debt compared to male entrepreneurs. So that's one positive factor that we see in terms of trying to support women in business, women entrepreneurs. They're more conscious about making an effort to pay whatever debts that they may have. So I think in terms of the private sector, we need to probably discuss with government how we can diversify the economy, how we can attract foreign direct investment to help support the economy. I mean, a lot of our FDIs are from China and Japan for now. Majority of our investment comes from China and Japan. And from ASEAN, because we are a small economy, a lot of our food, consumable products do come from the ASEAN region. So we import a lot of our food stuff, consumable goods within ASEAN. And we do have the green lane to ensure that we do have sufficient food for the people here. And probably that's the industry that is being supported by government, the food-based industry, in terms of ensuring that the locals here are not deprived of their daily needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Mr. Vijay Poonoosamy from QI Group, your perspective, please, on the role of the private sector.
Thank you, Dr. Vannarith. See, I've always learned that if you want to go far, especially in this destabilized and fractured world, it is still wise not to go alone. Now, ASEAN states and stakeholders must therefore help develop a cohesive and responsive ASEAN community. Now, enhancing regional trade and regional connectivity is critical, but it's also urgent because, to my mind, regional supply chains and markets are more resilient and environmentally friendlier, and because it looks to me that regional tourism will take off earlier than long-haul tourism. But more fundamentally, I believe that trustworthiness and transparency must be at the heart of everything, because regional nation building requires a sense of belonging and a sense of pride, both of which cannot be instilled amidst exclusions, fear, inequities, injustices, and inequalities. These social ills clearly become toxic when mixed with bad governance, anti-democratic values, and leaders without integrity in the public and private sectors. See, the traditional claim that stronger economic growth is the best antidote to inequality because everyone is supposed to get a bigger slice of a larger pie is actually hard to swallow. It's even harder to digest, as I recall the report which was released by Oxfam earlier this year, showing that the world's 26 richest billionaires own as many assets as the world's poorest, 3.8 billion. So as it's been mentioned a few times in our panel, I also agree that the fight against poverty and inequalities is critical in the process of regional nation building because it's clearly economically counterproductive, socially unsustainable, and politically suicidal for the few to exclude the many. The more so, as in this new normal, communities moved from having to accept what cannot be changed to having to change what cannot be accepted. So I think the Asian community, as a community of linked interests, requires that governments, businesses, and civil society work together because we depend on each other and we need each other. And all must work for the development of a just, caring, sustainable, safe, resilient, virtuous, and happy ASEAN family. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vijay. Very inspiring when it comes to this kind of concept of multi-stakeholdership and the value of ASEAN and based on trust, virtue, and so on. Now I would like to move to Dr. Tommy too. You know that ASEAN is developing a comprehensive economic recovery, and the document perhaps will be adopted at the ASEAN Summit in this November. Do you have any insights on that economic recovery plan of ASEAN, Dr. Tu?
Hi, it's very important questions. Actually, to be honest, I'm not involved in much with the track one discussions this year. Yeah, but I think as far as I know, in Vietnam, the Ministry of Trade and Commerce and Industry, they're in charge of that, and they are still working very closely with partners, ASEAN partners. And just a few days ago, there's a meeting going on, and at a ministerial levels to discuss about that. Actually, I would like to just add some point on the recommendations for the challenge that we are facing now, and which is not quite out of your questions, but is still in line with the panelists. I think facing the challenge, which is very special challenge today, we should look at a broader pictures, and I totally agree that we are now having both opportunity and challenges. And the opportunities is actually that the COVID-19 is a facilitator for us to move much faster into digital transformations. And if we look at the challenge, not only from COVID, but also from the industrialization revolution 0.40, we can see that even without the COVID, we still have to move fast into digital transformation. And the focus, I think, for ASEAN, especially, we need to deal with more focus on education, especially for training, retraining, and upskilling for the workers. I think one of the panelists has mentioned that the percentage of the the working population who can work online from home is now only 7%. But we will very soon see a change in the production structure, the way that the company restructure their working life, and we will see that the demand for high-skilled workers who can be able to work from home will be really in high demand, and I think ASEAN need to prepare for that, and we need to cooperate on that sense. Another point, I think ASEAN should really put more focus on the physical and trade policy coordinations. I think on the trade side, we have been doing well with moving the RCEP forward, and we are really hope that it can be be concluded end of this year. I think RCEP will open great opportunities, especially in these critical times when we are seeing the moving, the reallocations of supply chain. So RCEP is actually also another facilitator for ASEAN to create a more resilient, more coordinated supply chain, regional supply chain. And the other areas of cooperations, I think, is on physical. As I mentioned earlier before, ASEAN country will soon face problems of public debt, and I think we have experienced with the financial crisis before, and we really need to put more focus on like ASEAN +3 financial corporations in this critical time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Hopefully the ASEAN recovery plan, which will be adopted by the end of this year, will include some of the points that we raised at this panel, including your perspective and proposal. Next, to connect with this OSEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which will be adopted by November or by the end of this year, perhaps without the participation of India at this stage. So I would like to seek the opinion from our Australian friends, Mr. Leigh, which is one of the key partners of ASEAN and one of the key active members of negotiating OSEP. So what is the Australian perspective on the realization or conclusion of OSEP by the end of this year? Mr. Leigh.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. And I should clarify that I speak on behalf of the Victorian government, not the Australian government. So I'll be careful in my comments. But it's fair to say that there's a joint perspective that overall there's a unified support for ASEAN to achieve its objectives, and that includes free trade and trade liberalisation, where agreements enhance and facilitate that and provide access to new trade and investment opportunities, or increased trade and investment opportunities, then that's a good thing. And by and large, ASEAN and Australia have a very large number of free trade agreements. In fact, more free trade agreements between Australia and either nations or ASEAN itself exist than any other region or part of the world for Australia. Most notably recently, the ISEPA with Indonesia, which was a unique one as well. But in terms of the fact that it was more than just an FTA, there was this much broader opportunity for ongoing development and dialogue as industries develop and unfold, which I think is a wise approach to have something that's more of a economic partnership approach. And it goes to the point, I know one of the questions we were talking about earlier before the panel, or we received from the organisers, was about dialogue partnerships in general. And I think that more than just transactional trade and investment, which is, the historically a way a lot of things go on, the opportunity to access expertise, to access best practice, both the economic recovery for future capacity building is the way of the future. It's the sensible way forward. And I'd also note that, you know, it's not always about learning from your partner's successes. It's sometimes learning from your partner's failures, but being able to adopt best practice where it suits any country's or any region's individual circumstances would make sense. As a state government, we practice an open door policy. We encourage governments to explore a lot of our plans and work that we're doing. One example that comes to mind, and I know I'm getting quite micro compared to what RCEP has to offer, but several years ago, our government, our state government, developed an industry development plan for medicinal cannabis. Now, it's fair to say that many nations in ASEAN have traditionally had a very conservative view on cannabis, and of course, I'm referring to the historic illicit trade of cannabis, not medicinal cannabis. But this is something that's a new industry, an industry that's emerging, and it's opening up opportunities. And we were sharing that information with our counterparts, and you know, had more than one health minister and trade minister looking to take a look at what was inside that type of industry development plan. And as I say, not just learn from our successes and where we've gone forward, and had both at a health perspective and an industry's perspective the ability to offer a blueprint for a way forward, but also things that maybe we learnt along the way as well. So in terms of dialogue partnership overall and free trade agreements or broader economic partnership agreements as they stand, then we embrace and welcome those, and where they benefit economies and people more broadly, then they're a good thing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ambassador Masataka Fujita, Japanese perspective on ASEAN.
Well, first of all, I'm very glad to hear that ASEAN will be concluded this year. And I don't know whether this is still the political commitment or just a hope, but in ASEAN minus India, perhaps, we conclude that be good, because this is an area where the ASEAN can continue to play a kind of centrality role, as it started with ASEAN initiative. And what is more important, in fact, for Japanese companies, Japanese economy, is actually looking inside composition countries of the ASEAN, as you know, so China, Korea, and Japan's included. And these three countries, big countries in Asia, but do not have any FTA. So because of this, actually these three countries have kind of the FTA. And ASEAN countries can also enjoy the relationship between three big Asian countries. I think this is, of course, a big achievement if the ASEAN be concluded. I think this is my idea on ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Next, I would like to invite Ambassador Michalak on ASEAN and other issue solution for ASEAN as it move forward. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I found the conversation very interesting in this past session. I thought Vijay's remarks were right on target, not only in this intervention, but in his earlier one, and Leigh Howard's as well, and Ambassador Fujita's, of course. I think that when we talk about how ASEAN can leverage its centrality, how ASEAN can leverage its dialogue partners, the key word there is partnership. I think that all of the challenges that we've talked about with ASEAN are exactly the same challenges faced by every country around the world in this time of COVID, whether you are rich or poor or in between. And I guess the idea here is that the fact that they're the same doesn't make them any less severe. And the other thing is that the fact that they are the same that everybody else faces should not be an excuse. We still need to move ahead and try to resolve them. I know that in some ways I should not be the one saying these things, looking at some of the developments in my own country. But I think that the fact that we are talking about partnership today and talking about ASEAN today means that not only is RCEP a key model for partnership moving into the future, but don't forget the CPTPP, which is also a grouping of, as Vijay was talking, maybe some like-minded countries who are looking to push the boundaries not only of trade and investment liberalization, but also the liberalization of the digital economy. Again, we have talked much in this session about how the digital economy is going to be central to whatever type of recovery we make. And I believe that some of the provisions of the CPTPP are going to be models for going forward. The United States has not done a great job on COVID, but if you look at the agreement which we reached with Japan, the recent trade agreement we reached with Japan, in that agreement, you will see that there is provisions on the digital economy which build on the provisions which were in the CPTPP. So again, I think that I agree with Vijay that trying to leverage partnerships by working with some of your partners who have best practices to share, who have thought leadership products to share, to have a more open kind of a relationship. Again, the keys, and I keep referring to Vijay because I don't know, maybe I'm channeling him or he's channeling me, but I had earlier written down and a couple of things that I wanted to talk about, and that is building trust, transparency are two of the biggest factors that we're going to need going forward. And these are the biggest factors that ASEAN is going to need going forward. And trying to work with the dialogue partners on those issues, I think, is one of the things where ASEAN can really benefit from. Many of ASEAN's trading partners have been supporting the ASEAN low value shipment program as a way to facilitate trade. We've been working on this for 2 or 3 years now, and it is still very, very, it's not very far from the starting line, let's put it that way. And it would seem that after 3 years, we should be a little bit farther than that. We are now on the verge, we're not even in the middle of this yet, but we are on the verge of perhaps doing a pilot project, which is wonderful. We were ready to do this, I think, a year ago. But at any rate, like I say, I'm not one to talk because of what's going on in my own country, but I do think that the ideas of working on best practices, working on integration, working on cooperation, and working on coordination, even within ASEAN economies. I don't know how many times we have run into a regulation which is sponsored by one ministry within an ASEAN member state, and that regulation contradicts a regulation from another ministry within that same ASEAN member state, not to mention the differences among different ASEAN member states. So coordination, best practices, trust, transparencies. We last night had a chance to participate in the meeting of ASEAN economic ministers as part of the US delegation, and we were given some chance as the private sector to talk about some of our suggestions for ASEAN trade ministers. And one of the things that we told them was that, and I'm quoting from one of our speeches last night, which is that as many countries around the world are putting up barriers to trade in the global economy due to COVID-19, ASEAN would be best served by uniting and focusing on becoming a coherent 650 million person market that remains a staunch defender of the rules-based, transparent global trading system. And this is exactly why trade agreements are important and why the digital economy is important. And speaking as a member of one of the partners for ASEAN, we stand ready to work with you and are the 165 members of the US-ASEAN Business Council stand ready to try to work with you to improve coordination and to improve the two-way street for mutually beneficial development going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ambassador. We still have only 2 minutes left before we conclude our panel discussion. I would like to stress several keywords that the panelists has raised with regards to the future directions of ASEAN. So we have a set of proposals with regards to supply chains, how to make it more resilient and resistant to shocks. We also discussed about inequality, how to reduce inequality across the region and within the member state of ASEAN. Also inequality with regard to gender issue. Third point would be the unemployment issue. ASEAN has certain role to play, although unemployment is a national issue, but as a regional institution, ASEAN could promote these job opportunities through the trade, investment, labor movement, tourism, etc. The facilitation of those sectors would generate more job opportunities. Next, fourth point would be the SME, small medium enterprises, which are the most vulnerable to crisis and shocks. And the national and regional government has critical role to play in order to save their business, how to support those small and medium enterprises, which most of the case are owned by women entrepreneurs. So that is the fourth point. The fifth point is about digital transformation. I think all of us agree that COVID-19 is the catalyst or driver of digital transformation. But the key question is how to make our digital transformation more inclusive, because some of you also raised the problem of digital divide. So that is another challenge for us, is to promote inclusive digital economy across the regions. Last but not least, I think comes to the partnership that ASEAN need to further strengthen within itself and with the dialogue partners. And this partnership should be based on trust, transparency, rule-based, and the common norms and standards. So I would like to say thank you. I think all the participants here, we have 60+ participants, join me to thank all the distinguished panelists for their insights and very interesting and active dialogue. It's not easy to moderate virtual panel discussions, but I think we made it, all of us made it. I would like to congratulate all the panelists, and I hope that we can meet in person at some point. So thank you all, stay healthy and sound. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chheang, Vannarith, and members of our distinguished panel for an excellent discussion. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, please give us a few minutes to do a quick turnover of our virtual stage and do stay around for our next panel on entrepreneurship, social enterprise, and startups.